of 2003, he wrote this in a civil case, in a filing. The defendant entered the Greeley Police Department and told a detective that he had privileged information regarding the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. The defendant said that the family should be informed Jonelle died before crossing 10th Street and not give the family hope. How in the world does he know she crossed 10th Street? Where her body was found, they'd had to cross 10th Street. Where he lived was just across 10th Street. If you look at Exhibit 70, Greeley back in 1983, there you could have gone north, you could have gone north, east, or west and not crossed 10th Street. There are fields everywhere those other directions. How did he know that? Because he did it. So let's talk about what the evidence shows us happened December 20th, 1984. And this is what I suggest the evidence says, but ladies and gentlemen, you're the ultimate fact finder. What does the evidence tell you? Jonelle was an outspoken, vivacious 12-year-old middle schooler, excited about Christmas break. She was a tween, as we say nowadays, playing sports, involved in her church, doing really well in school, and someone that loved hanging out with her friends. On December 20th, the honor choir performed at a bank right down here where we are, just a few blocks away. The defendant drove an orange car at this time. We have pictures from his lot. We know he was downtown, December 19th, arrested in a bank just a block away. We can see that in People's Exhibit 206. And if you look closely, just as Rochelle Baxley said, the bus was parked facing west, and a little rust-colored car drove by and scared Jonelle. Rochelle said, this has haunted her for years. We don't know what the connection is, whether Jonelle and her family were leaving church one day and the defendant drove by in that car and flipped them off, as Angela described him doing on occasion, or whether Jonelle had an encounter with him as she walked home from school. The defendant later sees Russell Ross driving two young girls home, Russell's daughter and Jonelle Matthews. He sees Jonelle get dropped off at an obviously empty house. Garage doors open, no cars in the garage, no cars out in front of the house, no lights on. He sees Jonelle go in and turn the lights on. At 8:42, Jason C. describes his dog barking incessantly. That's when he is confirming that she is home alone, looking in the backyard windows and looking in the front yard windows, and he goes to one of the doors. Whether he pretends to be a trusted adult, as he says in his own words a number of times, maybe someone was being a trusted adult, pretending to be a trusted adult, or whether he pulled that gun we know he had on him and forced her out of the house. Either way, he took her that night. At some point, likely before crossing 10th Street, Jonelle resists. Jonelle tries to get away. He grabs her by the jacket, pulls it over her head as she struggles to get away. Her hand bones were found in her jacket while the jacket's still zipped and it's inside out. He shoots her point blank. And now he has to figure out what to do. Whether he did it that night, whether he did it the next day and left for California, or whether he did it when he got back, we don't know. But at some point, he recalls a field he drove by multiple times when he went to Clody's, or when he drove a sugar beet truck, or when he drove around the county for 7-Up, a desolate place. He tells Ed Densel, if you guys remember, during that interview, he says, there were no oil and gas operations in that field in 1984. He doesn't say that area, he says that field. He takes her out there and he conceals her body in a shallow grave, not to be unearthed for nearly 36 years. While the Matthews and many other people's hearts were breaking, they worried and wondered where Jonelle was, and he was the only one that knew until it was unearthed in 2019. After he kidnapped and murdered Jonelle, he nervously looks out his window. He wonders if the police are onto him. He's so paranoid, he thinks two random cars that come up and do a U-turn are possibly cop cars. Still paranoid, on December 21st, he orders Angela, "We're going to California, go pack the car." So ladies and gentlemen, before I get more into this, I want to talk about the jury instructions the judge just read to you, and I want to thank you for your time and attention. This has been a very long trial, and there's been so much evidence presented that I don't think I can summarize it all in a closing argument, so rely on your memories and listen to what I say, but there is a lot of evidence in this case. And I think it's important, jury instruction number 1, common sense. That's the last sentence of instruction number 1. And it was about a month ago where we talked about this in jury selection. You don't check your common sense in at the door. You use it to decide what happened here. And I submit to you, your common sense tells you exactly what happened here. He murdered Jonelle Matthews, December 20th, 1984. Instruction number 2 is the reasonable doubt instruction the judge went over with you. And I think it's important to note that this case has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, that there is overwhelming evidence of his guilt. And while we're talking about it, I want to talk about Norris Drake. Peggy Drake said the defense told her that Norris Drake was reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not reasonable doubt. It is speculative and nothing more. He left close to 10 based on Peggy Drake's testimony that she was nervous about the news starting and she wanted to go to bed. His mom said the day after this happened, December 21st of 1984, Norris Drake left the house around 9:30. I saw him, he was looking at something, and then he drove away. His mom saw him drive away. There are no shoe prints that match the Matthews house in the Drake driveway, in the pile of snow in front of their house. Norris Drake is a red herring, and he is not reasonable doubt. He is mere speculation. Remember, the dog started barking at 8:42 incessantly at the Matthews fence. The Cosby Show was still going. The Cosby Special was still going on HBO. This defendant did it beyond a reasonable doubt. Instruction number 8, we spent a lot of time on. That's a circumstantial evidence instruction. And I want to talk to you about that because there is overwhelming circumstantial evidence in this case, but there is also direct evidence. The defendant's own statements are direct evidence. Angela Hick's testimony is direct evidence of his guilt. So you don't have to just rely on circumstantial. The judge went over instruction 12, which was first-degree murder after deliberation, felony murder, and kidnapping. And I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that all those elements have been proven. We know there was a gun involved. We know she was taken from her house by force. She is found in the same clothes she wore to the concert that night. At some point, she resisted, and the defendant pulled the gun and shot her in the head. So I submit to you, the one thing you're wondering, the defendant, why did he do it? And it was this man. We know he had guns. We know he had 2 guns at one point, and on the stand, he told you he gave it to his dead uncle. But let's look at what makes it him. I want to talk about one other thing that got thrown in there. You heard about a new charge that you didn't hear about at the beginning, false reporting. He is guilty of that every time he talked to law enforcement. What he told them wasn't true. He was misdirecting them. But he is guilty of something much more sinister. He is guilty of kidnapping and murder. Based on all the evidence you heard, he is guilty of false reporting, but these much more serious crimes. So let's talk about what makes him guilty of murdering Jonelle Matthews, December 20th, 1984. And I want to walk through his statements. You have Exhibit 209, which is very thorough. It's a 70-something page document that you can walk through all the statements he's made over time, all his activities over time. But I want to highlight some of them. And some of them aren't in there because they were witness testimony. January 17th, 1985, the defendant calls then Detective Jack Statler. He's the lead detective at the time, and the defendant says he's an ordained minister, got ordained from some Baptist church in California, and through his pastoral duties, learned something about the Mary Pierce case and the Jonelle Matthews case. He asked the detective to say, hey, tell me what's going on in that case, and maybe I'll compare it to my notes and then let you know if they match. He also said, less than a month after Jonelle went missing, there is definite evidence that Jonelle had been abducted and probably dead prior to leaving the house. This is January 17th, 1985. Everyone is still holding out hope Jonelle ran away. He's the only one declaring her dead because he did it. Again, Detective Statler said, I'm not telling you anything, pal. And the defendant told Statler he would take this as a negative and go investigate it further himself. And remember, shortly after the defendant calling Detective Statler on January 17th, 1985, he gets a call from Jim Christie. Jim Christie called him and said, hey, Steve Pankey just reached out to me and said he heard two drunk people that may have information on Jonelle. Jim Christie said it seemed like the defendant was trying to get information on the case from him. He then confirms the defendant has a lot of run-ins with Russell Ross. Jim Christie told Detective Statler that back in December 17th, 1985. Fast forward a couple weeks to January 29th, 1985. The defendant comes in for an interview with the FBI. Now, Jack Statler confirms his information, says, you're the guy I was talking to on the phone. The defendant says, yeah, and I think that person I was talking to was just trying to impress me. I'm still not telling you anything because of my pastoral privilege. But he might still try and get that person to come to the police department. The defendant then goes on to meet with FBI agent Lyon. He tells FBI agent Lyon that under the right circumstances, Russell Ross or Pastor Christie could do this. He knows that both of them and does not trust them. He goes on to describe that he had been in trouble with Russell Ross while working at 7-Up and said, Pastor Christie has some mistress named Debbie Moon and the sheriff's office should investigate it. And then he leaves this interview, spreading misinformation, trying to get information on his own, and says he sleeps better than he slept in a long time. That's because police aren't on to him. That is exactly why he slept well. At this point in time, he's just trying to get information, asserting some sort of pastoral privilege. He's not trying to say he has information after the fact. He is trying to get information. He is named in 2 police reports out of almost 300 in 1985. He is a blip on the Greeley Police Department's radar and nothing more. He moves around the country, ultimately settling in Idaho. In Idaho, he begins to use the Jonelle Matthews murder for manipulation of the system. We catch back up with him in 1997. Officer Edgerton came in and testified that she was on a simple traffic stop when the defendant walked up and started videotaping her. And she said, you're causing officer safety issues, get away from me. And he told her, don't fuck with me, I've buried more people than you know. Officer Edgerton looks at him and says, oh yeah, where? And he said, Colorado. Just a few months later, in the middle of 1997, he writes this in a written statement that Sun Valley Police Department is creating a lengthy file on him. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this is, Angela hasn't talked to police. He is inserting himself into the investigation again. Exhibit 160, also 1997, he sends a fax to the police chief of Sun Valley Police Department that he is leaving a clear paper trail on his position in the Jonelle Matthews case. After this, he begins making countless filings with inconsistent but very incriminating statements and outright taunting law enforcement. On April 26th, 1999, he describes himself, his true self. He is a master manipulator. This narcissist is saying the state will not be able to solve Jonelle Matthews' disappearance without his help, without his cooperation. Remember, he tells Ed Dentzel that he's not a legal system virgin. He knows exactly what he's doing. If he says, oh, I know something after the fact, he can try and get immunity. He knows the statute of limitations is ran. He's trying to get immunity, so he can't be sitting here today like he is. He even manipulated his own mental health expert. He's not someone that has a mental health disorder. He is a master manipulator, and that was a diagnosis by Steve Pankey when you heard him testify in court the other day. In fact, he testified, the initial doctor, Dr. Schneider was her name, said he has no diagnosable conditions, and she was absolutely right. And most recently, the master manipulator tried to manipulate you when he took the witness stand. In this same document of April 26, 1999, he talks about the state, Colorado, hoping the defendant, who is the appellant in this, will reveal the location of Miss Matthews' body, and then the state will double-cross him. Greeley police haven't talked to him since 1985, yet he's putting this in all his pleadings, using his murder of Jonelle Matthews as leverage. On August 3rd, 2001, he describes himself a subject of a capital murder investigation. Again, this is clearly a reference to murder, a capital crime. And he continues to make statements about Jonelle Matthews and really no other cold case throughout these pleadings. I talked about this quote earlier from April 27th, 2003. He writes about knowing Jonelle was dead before 10th Street. He lives across 10th Street. Where her body was found, you'd have to cross 10th Street to get there. He knows this because he did this. Now, eventually, starting in 2011, he starts sending letters to my office, several years after all these pleadings we're talking about, basically saying, hey, I'm right here. Did you forget about me? I still want immunity for what I did back in 1984. Included in this is the alibi letter from August 17th of 2013, where he includes unnecessary minutia, detail that makes no sense to include in an alibi letter. And I want to talk about this. Why do you need an alibi letter if you didn't do anything? Greeley police haven't talked to him since 1985, so he sends the DA's office here an alibi letter. Why do you need to ask for a deal? Why do you need to ask for immunity if you didn't do anything? He wrote this letter to account for everything Angela might remember from around this time frame. Remember, when he sat up there, he wanted his deal to include a stipulation that this is a true statement of facts. If that happens, then that's the truth, and whatever Angela says isn't. That's exactly why he wrote this letter. Why does he offer mundane, inconsistent, and unnecessary details in this letter? Why does he mention the dogs if he allegedly got rid of them in June in this letter? Why does he say there are no other cars on a car lot that he just renewed the advertisement in the Greeley phone book? Why does he misrepresent the weather conditions? He'd gone in and out of that driveway, in his own words, to get Pepsi that day, and then we know he went out the day before because he got arrested at the bank right down here. And why does he describe with the outlandish details the two vehicles that come in and do a U-turn? Why does he even mention this? He later says, I went and searched where those police officers shine their flashlights. Why does he do that? It didn't happen. Why does he talk about a dealer plate? You've heard a little bit of testimony about that. We had a guy talk about license plates. I learned more than I've ever known about license plates, frankly. And he said, you can go anywhere on a dealer plate. So why does he even mention that in this alibi letter? He describes them going to bed early. Ladies and gentlemen, remember what Angela told you on the stand. She had to work all night. They'd never traveled before. She had to get the car ready. She had to get the kid ready. She had to get the food ready. And she was up all night getting the car ready to go to California the next morning. And we'll talk more about Angela in a second. August 14th, 2013, he writes another letter to my office with a couple interesting statements. Again, talking about a good alibi, but not a great alibi. No one asked for an alibi. No one's talked to him about this case. And after Miss Matthews disappeared, I drove across several state lines, which brings me to the next portion of this August 14th letter. He's traveling across state lines, citing the Lindbergh Law, which is a federal law taking kidnapped children across state lines. Why is he citing that? If a dude with a history of violence against women had gained understated knowledge, he would need immunity from prosecution. So he wouldn't have to sit here and face the consequences of his actions December 20th of 1984. He goes on to say another interesting line in this letter of August 14th, 2013. And I want you to focus on number one there. Which is more important, Jonelle Matthews or the Jonelle Matthews case? That is an outrageous taunt by a murderer. He's saying, if you want Jonelle Matthews' body, you have to say she is more important than the case against him by giving him immunity. Because if we say the case isn't important and give him immunity, he tells us where the body is. What's more important, Jonelle Matthews or the Matthews case? An outrageous taunt. We've talked about this letter, but on August 15th, in another letter to my office, 2013, this one is just so telling. Some experiences are hard to forget. He experienced this. He knows if he gets a deal or immunity, he can't be charged. He knows after the statute of limitations, if he was just an accessory or someone that learned about it and helped after the fact, he couldn't be charged because of the statute of limitations. These are some of the statements he made that I wanted to point out, but there are a whole bunch in Exhibit 209. But something else that's important to point out in Exhibit 209 are all of his searches on his devices. Exhibit 185 are his searches from July 23rd, and it's a little bit difficult to read. But I want you to think about this. At 5:34, he starts searching for Jonelle more than he had in a long time. He searched for her all the time, but he really intensifies his searches at 5:34 on July 23rd, 2019. At around 5:30, Detective Fick has been paged out to a body being found out at County Road 49 and 34 and a half. No one else knows about it. The DA doesn't even know about it yet. The detectives on the case don't even know about it. Yet he starts searching at that point in time more intensely than he ever has in recent times. Remember, the forensic computer expert, Darren Ford, testified that there are a number of apps someone can sit and listen to or get banners for on your phone. He could sit out in Idaho and listen to Weld County Dispatch. And I submit to you that's what the evidence shows you he did. Exhibit 192. This is an 8-page document that goes over the defendant's search history spanning July 25th through July 27th, 2019. He is on his devices continually searching for Jonelle Matthews. At one point in this exhibit, if you look at it closely, at 10:37 p.m. on July 25th, he searches Jonelle Matthews until the next day at 2:49 in the morning. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 2019 version of what he made Angela do back in 1984. He Googled and Googled Jonelle Matthews. In 1984, he made Angela turn the station over and over again to hear news about Jonelle Matthews. He made Angela go to the grocery store and get the newspaper for that day and all the days they were out of town. A 1984 version of a Google search. Newspapers and radio. Now let's fast forward to August 15th, 2019. The day the defendant claims Detective Prill spit on him, which the evidence shows otherwise, he goes and meets with the detectives, and you can hear the recording. It's a rather congenial meeting. They aren't being rude or mean or anything like that. He goes back into his apartment, gets on his computer, and starts creating documents, creating an action plan, creating a Greeley timeline. Look at August 17th on People's Exhibit 209. It is like 5 pages long, if I remember right. But specifically, and this is all I could fit that was legible, hopefully, from part of his action plan. And just look through it. He starts accusing Greeley police of isolating him, want police to release holdback evidence. Remember, that was his platform when he ran for sheriff. Send vulgar emails to GPD. Humiliate the GPD and the DA's office, among many other things he did on August 17th. What is not mentioned is go tell him I didn't do it. He goes on the offensive. If a cop asks you about a murder you had nothing to do with, you say I didn't do it, you don't go on the offensive against the cops. And this apparently was one of his last phases because he testified to phase 7 when he was on the stand, going on the offensive. I submit to you there were 3 phases in this. Phase 1 was in 1985 when he went to get information to see if he was on their radar. Then he disappeared into the wind. The statute of limitations had ran on some crimes he could claim he was involved with, like tampering with evidence. He then says, wow, I could get immunity for that, and I can't be charged with that. So he keeps asking for immunity. Immunity is never given. So he goes rogue. He goes rogue and starts getting action plans, starts going on the offensive. Because he knows he's going to end up in this seat. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you do not have to rely on this direct evidence, his statements. You guys have the awesome power that if you believe Angela Hicks beyond a reasonable doubt, you can find him guilty of murder in the first degree and kidnapping. Especially when you couple what she told you on the stand with all his statements over the years. She describes December 21st, she is at home because that's where he expects her to be. And he announces they are leaving the following morning before sunrise to California to go see his family in Big Bear. It's unexpected. He wasn't going to go. He was going to pocket his dad's money. And then he was even more mad when he sent him gas cards. But he has to flee because of what he had done. Angela looks at him and says, what about our dogs? He says, I got rid of them, took care of them. She never sees the dogs again. Remember, Mark said he remembers dogs at the house all the time. Maybe the dogs were smelling what he was bearing out in front, or smelling the red car at the back of the house, and he had to get rid of them. He tells Angela to pack the car, which she did, but they'd never traveled before. Their entire time together, they'd never traveled, so she didn't know what she was doing. She stayed up late getting everything ready, and they leave early the next morning before sunlight. They make the trek out to California in silence. He even says it in his own words. He didn't turn the radio on the entire way out there so his wife and son could sleep, corroborating what Angela told you. 17 hours of sleep or however long it takes, that's crazy. They make the trek out there, and Angela describes having to buy presents for the kids because his family had mailed their presents, so Mark wouldn't have anything under the tree, so she goes to the grocery store and buys a Hot Wheel. He gets in a fight with his dad on Christmas Day, and they head back to Colorado. Again, in silence, until they get close enough to get local radio stations. He asked her to turn on the radio, and when a story comes on about Jonelle Matthews, he says, leave it there. Now go find another story about Jonelle Matthews. He's paranoid that the law is catching up with him. He's listening to hear Steve Pankey is a suspect, but nothing. That's why he called Detective Statler January 17th. They get back to Greeley and drive right past their house to the Safeway about 20 blocks away. They'd been driving for hours, yet he says we're going to the Safeway and orders Angela to get the newspapers. She describes reading every article about Jonelle Matthews to the defendant. Listens intently to see what the police knew. Exhibit 199 is what Angela describes his behavior in the next few days. They get home. He gets straight out of the car and starts digging by the septic tank. We don't know if he's digging something up. We don't know if he's burying something. We don't know if he's moving something to the red car in the back of the property. We don't know what's in the car that starts on fire in the back of the property. Another blanket, bloody clothes, a pistol. And Angela does not think about this case again, except for the prayers she talked about. She doesn't get a paycheck one day in 1999 while they're in Idaho. Her boss and landlord, she goes and asks, why didn't I get that? And she says, well, you haven't paid rent. So she goes to the defendant, says, hey, you haven't paid the rent. And he said, yeah, I have to keep paying attorneys because cops in Idaho won't give me immunity for Jonelle Matthews. And Angela can't hide her expression and says, Jonelle Matthews? And he looks at her and says, you don't think I could have hurt her? You look just like her. There's Angela in 1984. Angela describes her blood running cold after he makes this statement. But before going too overboard, she goes to talk to the local police to say, hey, is he really coming to you guys trying to get immunity for Jonelle Matthews? And they confirm her fears. Yeah, he's been in to ask for immunity. So she requests newspaper articles from Greeley, Colorado. And she puts notes on them to give to the police. That's exhibit 165. She brackets, signs of possible foul were also found at the scene. Details are not being released. Next to it, she writes, Steve was rambling about rake marks in the snow. I get why neighbors or coworkers might know about rake marks, but there is no reason he should know about it unless he committed this crime. And he understands the importance of that, and that's why I got up and told you the tale he told you on the stand. The master manipulator took the stand. He claims that in 1992, 7 years before Angela had even talked to police, Lockwood talked to him. He said, hey, you're probably going to have to testify against Jim Matthews. And he didn't want to do that. And then apparently Lockwood gave him a soda, had him take a drink out of it, took it from him, and said, now I have your DNA, before that was even a thing. And he said during that time is when Lockwood told him about the rake marks. First of all, there's no way Lockwood knew about the rake marks. They had even talked to Greeley police in 1992. Don't let this self-proclaimed master manipulator manipulate you. Exhibit 200. This is a 2-page article where Angela highlighted Pastor Christie's name. And she says at one point, Pastor Christie was his best friend, and then they became bitter enemies, at least in the defendant's mind. She goes on the next page to say Steve writes Pastor Christie as villains in a book he's writing, as a villain. Exhibit 201, an article regarding Russ Ross. Russ Ross's name is underlined, and she noted, well, actually, the Officer McConnell, Detective McConnell, noted on that for her that Russ Ross had been sued by the defendant and was his abusive former boss. Angela told police this in 1999. She thought something was being done about it, and unfortunately it wasn't, and we sit here 22 years later. That's a horrible thing, but it's time to do the right thing. She wrote that in 1999, and she told you a consistent story on the stand in 2021. McConnell remembered some of the details. They matched exactly what Angela told you. Angela's statement does not have different phases like someone else here. Angela went on to describe to you a statement he made February 1985 when they were planning searches for Jonelle. The churches around Greeley were reaching out to parishioners saying, hey, we want to help Sunnyview search for Jonelle. Do you want to join the search? And at his church, Faith Ministries, the minister went on to say, I have a word from God that Jonelle Matthews is still alive. He calls him a false prophet. Again, that's when people still thought she was alive. She might have run away. There was still hope. He is the only one certain she is dead. He even on the stand said, well, yeah, that was unethical of the pastor to say that. How was that unethical? Everyone was still holding out hope Jonelle was still alive. He knows it because he knew she was dead, because he did it. Angela goes on to describe the defendant at his son's celebration of life from when he was murdered in August of 2008. They brought the urn in the room, and he comes and prays over it and says, I hope this didn't happen because of Jonelle Matthews. I hope this didn't happen because of Jonelle Matthews. Vanessa, Angela's sister, saw the look on her face, couldn't make out what the defendant said, but describes the look on Angela's face. But there are certain things that corroborate Angela. I'd submit to you, she was truthful beyond a reasonable doubt. But look at corroboration for her. Her sister confirmed that in 1984, she was picked up at Stapleton Airport by the defendant, driving a red car. She confirmed the defendant was not allowing them to have radio, TV, or newspapers because she had to hide her Walkman. The defendant tries to change times, but his statements corroborate Angela. The septic tank, owning of firearms, no dogs, sudden moves to Texas right after he talks to the FBI, his hatred for Russell Ross, how he left Sunnyview. Angela had no motive to get him in trouble. By the time she sat up here and talked to you guys, they'd been divorced for nearly 20 years. Can't get any of the defendant's money. And if she is making it up, why doesn't she say, yeah, he confessed to me. Yeah, he had blood on his hands. Yeah, he drove a car that was reddish all the time. Yeah, he was gone for like 3 nights in a row. She doesn't. Her memory is brilliant because of all the odd things that happened that night. And she recalled it in 1999, thought it was done with, and recalled the same thing when she testified here. But also consider the other witnesses you heard from. Rochelle Baxley, we talked about her. A car drove by the concert that matches a car he owned, And she said Jonelle had a look of fear on her face. The defendant took that car to Anderson Salvage. Shoot, Kenny Anderson came in here, he doesn't know anyone, but he remembers a phony fire or a boyfriend-girlfriend fire on the inside of a car brought in by this man. Russell Baxley, Rochelle's dad, a church member at Sunnyview, describes the run-ins with the defendant, his beef with Russell Ross, dragging him out of the church because he refused to leave and dropping him by a red car. And he confirms what Rochelle told him back in 1984. Harold Reif, another church member that describes the defendant continually showing up at the church and having to be removed. his hatred for Russell Ross. And that is a theme throughout this case, right? I think the only one that didn't think he had a beef with the defendant was Russell Ross himself. The defendant meant nothing to him. He was moving on about his life, but Russell Ross had done the defendant wrong. He was angry about the changes at 7-Up, the first job he's even had for a couple years. Kind of liked that job, and then Russell Ross comes in and makes some changes, and he sues him, and then gets fired. Russell Ross, a member of the board at the church he was kicked out of. Russell Ross, a respected member of the church. The defendant even agrees there's bad blood between him and Russell Ross. In one of his writings, he calls Russell Ross his abusive supervisor. On the stand, he said he hated him. Rewind back to 1985. What does he tell the FBI? Russell Ross could have done this. I saw him drop him off, and I framed him. I saw him drop Russell Ross off, I saw him drop Jonelle Matthews off in an empty house. If he is willing to let an innocent cop he's supposed to care for writhe in pain for 10 or more minutes because of something else another cop had done, what is he willing to do to someone who did him wrong directly, someone he hated? Ladies and gentlemen, the truth does not change. His statements have, Angela's has not. And reality cannot be twisted. He is guilty of kidnapping and murdering Jonelle Matthews, December 20th, 1984.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Your Honor, I'd ask if we could go ahead and take a morning break so I can get set up.
Very well. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess until 5 after 10. I will advise you again that until the trial is completed, you must not discuss this case with anyone. That includes your family, people involved in the trial, other jurors, or anyone else. If someone approaches you and tries to discuss the trial with you, please let me know about it immediately. It's also important that you must not read or listen to any news reports of the trial. Do not in any way try to gain any information about this case outside of the courtroom. That includes refraining from researching on the internet, medical or law books, encyclopedias, or dictionaries. The social advisement continues throughout the trial. Finally, it is especially important that you do not form Please be seated. And the court continues on the record in 20 CR 1866. Parties and counsel are present. The jurors are present. Mr. Viorst.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing. It may seem to point very straight to one thing, but if you shift your point of view a little, you may find it pointing to an equally uncompromising manner to something entirely different. And that was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who penned the Sherlock Holmes novels back in the 1800s. For those of us who look at the world and their place in it at face value, you could see the evidence in this case pointing to Mr. Pankey as the appropriate suspect. But we are asking you, ladies and gentlemen, to shift your point of view in this matter, at least through the conclusion of your deliberations, to that of Mr. Pankey, and to see the world through his eyes as it's been presented in this courtroom over the last month. Mr. Pankey, as we've heard, lives in a world of conspiracy, paranoia, and self-esteem issues. And by way of example, this is a man who is certain that the Greeley and Sun Valley Police Departments are out to get him. They've got a vendetta against him, which really, frankly, probably not accurate, although in his mind it is. This is a man who believes he has a rivalry with Russ Ross, although, as the prosecutor stated a few moments ago, Russ Ross doesn't see it that way. Russ Ross hasn't really thought about Steve Pankey for 40 years. Russ Ross testified in this courtroom, and you could see that he really could care less about Steve Pankey. But in Steve Pankey's mind, there's a rivalry between them. This is a man who believes that the litigation surrounding his misdemeanor criminal cases in Idaho and his civil collection case in Idaho, all the pending litigation all stems from a secret agenda relating to the Jonelle Matthews case. He wrote briefs and stated to whoever would listen that these cases were really motivated by the state's desire to get him to be an informant in the Jonelle Matthews case. It wasn't true. It simply wasn't true. They weren't thinking about him. The state of Idaho wasn't thinking about him at that time. State of Colorado wasn't thinking about him. Certainly Action Collection Services, the civil collection company, wasn't thinking in those terms. They don't care about Jonelle Matthews, the Jonelle Matthews case. They probably don't know about the Jonelle Matthews case. And this is a man, ladies and gentlemen, who has run for governor in the state of Idaho and run for sheriff on multiple occasions without any real chance of winning. You heard from Lance Earl, his friend from Idaho, says, yeah, Steve really never had a chance. Still talks about running. This is a man who accused a local sheriff in Idaho of planting evidence at the scene of a murder. Likely didn't happen. In Steve's mind, it probably did. And a man who's confessed to a murder he didn't commit. He told Jan a story that he was involved in the Mary Pierce murder and a cult killing, when we know that the real murderer was located through DNA evidence and sent to prison. So in Steve's mind, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Pankey's mind, he lives in a world of conspiracy, paranoia, and low self-esteem. And we may not live there, but we're asking you to consider his state of mind when you think about this case. All right, so let's talk about direct versus circumstantial evidence for a moment. Instruction number 8 is the instruction that deals with that issue. The judge read it to you. I think you have a packet been provided. And what it says is that a fact may be proven by either direct or circumstantial evidence. Both are acceptable ways to prove something. Neither is necessarily more reliable than the other. Direct evidence is based on firsthand observation of the fact in question. Circumstantial evidence is indirect, based on observations of related facts that may lead you to reach a conclusion about the fact in question. So I suggest to you the only real direct evidence you have in this case is the testimony of Steve Pankey, to the extent that the question is, was Steve Pankey present at the Matthews home on December 20th of 1984? Sadly, Jonelle Matthews is no longer alive, so there's only one living person who can say whether Steve Pankey was present that night, and it's Steve Pankey. And Steve Pankey has told you directly, although he didn't have to get on the stand, and the judge told you he had the right to remain silent, and it couldn't be held against him. Mr. Pankey has told you that he was not present at the Matthews home that night. And that is direct evidence, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you're convinced, ladies and gentlemen, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Mr. Pankey got on that witness stand and lied to you when he said he wasn't at the Matthews home that night and had never met Jonelle Matthews, had never talked to her, and certainly didn't abduct or kill her. If you believe he lied when he said that, then you have the right to render a guilty verdict in this matter, if you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he lied to you. But if his testimony gave you any reasonable doubt as to Steve Pankey's guilt in this matter, you should render verdicts of not guilty. All right, so what did Mr. Pankey tell you when he testified? He said that he had been dishonest. Mr. Pankey admitted to you that he had been dishonest. He said he had gone to the police in 1985, January of 85, and told them that he had information about Jonelle Matthews' disappearance. He said the information he had was protected by pastoral privilege. He didn't have any information about Jonelle Matthews' murder. But he was dishonest with the police when he said he did. Similarly, he also told you that when he talked about Harold Hicks later on in 2019 and said that Harold Hicks had come to him and made a statement about a body needing to be buried. Again, he told you that he had been dishonest. So yeah, if you want to say, well, Steve's been dishonest, Mr. Pankey's been dishonest, and therefore he's dishonest about everything, again, that's your prerogative to do that. But again, we ask you to think about what he said on the stand, whether you believe he was credible, whether his testimony caused you to have any reasonable doubt in this matter, and we suggest to you that his testimony was credible. And when he testified, he explained that he did ask the police and the district attorney's office for a deal and for immunity, but he explained to you that although he had no information about Jonelle Matthews' disappearance and murder, he did want an agreement that he would not have to testify against anyone charged, and that he himself would not be charged. So he explained his statements to you about why he was asking for immunity and a deal, and he explained all the other statements that he made during the course of this investigation. And I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that his statements when he testified were credible. And let me give you some thoughts about why. So first of all, Mr. Pankey told you that he had been untruthful in the past when he talked to the police in 85, when he made that statement about Harold Hicks in 2019. But he told you that because of his faith, and he did talk about that a little bit on the witness stand, because of his faith and because of frankly, the laws relating to perjury, being untruthful on the witness stand, he was now wanting to be perfectly honest with you. And I guess one of the reasons why you could certainly conclude that his testimony was honest was because he said some things that weren't really helpful to him. And in particular, I'm referring, I guess, to his response to a jury question at the end of his testimony, where he was asked, well, was there more than one gun after you and Angela got together and before Jonelle Matthews disappeared? Was there more than one gun? And Ms. Hicks only knew about the one gun, the one he had from the detective agency. But Mr. Pankey's like, well, to be honest, no, there was more than one gun. There was one gun from the detective agency that I pawned, and then there was another gun that I gave to my cousin. So he said there were two guns. And he didn't have to tell you, he didn't have to say that. He could have just said, sure, there was only one gun. But Mr. Pankey was trying to be as brutally honest with you as he could, even to his own detriment. And we suggest to you that that indicates that he was being truthful when he testified in this matter. All right. So let's talk about the circumstantial evidence that's been presented in this case. All right, so did Mr. Pankey have any relationship whatsoever with the Matthews family? Try as they might, the prosecution has been completely unable to show that there's ever any relationship whatsoever between Mr. Pankey and the Matthews family. Mr. Pankey, we understand, and they, showed that Mr. Pankey was asked to leave the Nazarene Church in 78, spring of 78, well, actually 77, he came back in 78. He had been asked to leave it. Again, he's a difficult guy. He had been asked to leave, and he had come back for some choir practices. But even under the best case scenario, all they were able to show is that he came back the latest he came back really was spring of 78, and the earliest the Matthews ever got to the church was summer of 78. So there's really, and the Matthews said, we'd never heard of this guy. We didn't know who he was until he was charged. This guy was never anybody we ever met. And he says the same thing. So there's no indication whatsoever he had any connection. He had zero connection with the Matthews family. All right. He also had no motive, and again, we understand that, I guess, motive is not an element of the charge. We've discussed that previously. But be that as it may, motive would be something that might help you to determine whether he's guilty or not. If there was a motive, I think it would be more likely that he committed this crime, and lack of motive suggests he did not. So there's no motive. Jonelle Matthews was a 12-year-old girl. He didn't know her. Mr. Pankey had his own young child, about 5 years old, Mark Pankey, who did testify in this matter. And, so he was, although not father of the year, he was certainly an active father in his son's life, and you heard from Mark about that. And there's no indication whatsoever that he ever did anything to hurt Mark, he never had any inclination in any way to be violent toward a child. And in fact, all the statements he's made, if you look at the writings the things that he's written, which they've asked you to do, we ask you to also consider all the writings in which he said, Jonelle Matthews, and believe me, we all agree on this. She's a victim. It's a tragic situation. She's a human being. She deserves to be treated with respect. And, this is a tragedy for all concerned, not the least of which is Jonelle Matthews herself. It's a terrible tragedy when a young child dies. And everything Steve has ever said is consistent with that. It's consistent with that. All right, what else? Well, I mean, I understand the prosecution keeps saying there's no DNA testing in 1984. Okay, fine. And yet, there's no DNA. I mean, if there had been any blood at the scene or anything left there that could have been preserved, it could be tested now, certainly. and there's nothing. No signs of a struggle. Jonelle did not scream, as far as we know. And let me just address that for a minute, because, everybody says, the Matthews family, I think Pastor Christie said it, I think everybody who knew Jonelle said she was a feisty young girl. She was charismatic. She asserted herself. And yet, there's no indication that she ever screamed or resisted whoever took her away. And it would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that this was somebody that she knew or whose family she was connected to in some way, and not a total stranger as Mr. Pankey was. So again, no DNA, no signs of a struggle, no scream. Shoe prints. Let me talk to you for just a minute about the shoe prints. I know that the prosecution now sort of disavows any interest in the shoe prints, all right? And yet, the prosecution presented this report, Exhibit 212. The prosecution did that. And Exhibit 212, which we only have in hard copy, but you can go back and look at it in the jury room, says various shoes in the marketplace that have flat profiled outsoles of that heel to toe dimension most often correspond to sizes 8.5 to 9. I mean, that's an expert that they hired December 3rd of 2015 to say that. And then they presented some writings in which supposedly the expert disavowed his own report. I don't think that he did that. You can read, I guess, his own writings as well, his chapter in a book that he wrote. But he wrote a report for them saying that this person's, the perpetrator's shoe print was likely 8.5 to 9. And we know, the reason they introduced this, ladies and gentlemen, was because Detective Cash got a little confused and he thought, oh, well, Mr. Pankey's shoe prints correspond to that. And then when he was challenged on that, he's like, oh, yeah, you're right, never mind. His shoe size doesn't correspond. There was no shoe in that range of 8.5 to 9. And, Angela said his shoe size was 10 to 10.5. There's some suggestion maybe it was 9.5 to 10. There's certainly nothing in the 8.5 to 9 range. I'm not going to go as far as Johnny Cochran as to say, if the shoe don't fit, you must acquit. But, the shoe print doesn't fit. The shoe print doesn't fit, and that's something you can consider, ladies and gentlemen. All right. What else? No identification of Mr. Pankey at the Matthews home. I understand that there's no identification of anybody at the Matthews home, but if there had been somebody coming in from the outside, a stranger, you would probably expect someone to have seen something. Someone to have seen something. So, for instance, you heard from an officer who lived on one street over. He said he was coming over to 43rd Court that night to check on a young girl whose parents were out of town. He was looking down the street, up and down the street, right to where the Matthews home was. This is a police officer now. And he says if there had been any unusual car, any unusual person, he likely would have noticed it. All right. You also heard from a neighbor who said, yeah, my husband and I, we were fixing our fireplace that night. We were going back and forth during the course of the evening, and we didn't see anything. And you've heard from other people as well who say, they saw the garage, they recall the garage being up, but they don't recall seeing any unusual person in the area. And again, and remember, this house was just a few, and you can look at the exhibit, it's among others, Exhibit 60, which is the map. But you'll see that this house was just a few houses in from 4th Street. And 4th Street was a major, even back in '84, was a major east-west thoroughfare. And 4th Street well, you would not expect a stranger to perpetrate an abduction a few houses in from 4th Street under these circumstances, where you're near a major street, you're in a residential neighborhood with a lot of people watching. You wouldn't expect that, and certainly there's no evidence that Mr. Pankey was there that night, which you would expect under these circumstances, if he had done it. All right, what about this car evidence? And, the closest thing the prosecution came in this case to direct evidence of Mr. Pankey's guilt was this car evidence. So I do need to address it for a moment, all right? All right, so first of all, Rochelle Baxley comes into court, 37 years later and says, oh, by the way, there was a car that startled, there's a red or orange car that startled Jonelle that night. But Officer Roybal, I think Sergeant Roybal, I guess, came in. He was I think a patrol officer in '84. Said, "Look, I knew this was a big deal. I was taking reports that day. Kathy Baxley came in and said her daughter may have some information. Then Rochelle and Kathy came in together, and all Rochelle ever said, ever, on December 21st of 1984, was she didn't like her parents and she may have run away. That's all she ever said. And believe me, Officer Roybal, if he would have heard any inkling of any suspicious car of any kind, that would have been in his report. Everybody was looking for Jonelle. Everyone was worried about her. And he was taking the report specifically to help find her. And all Rochelle Baxley or her mother ever said was, she didn't like her parents, she might have run away. That's it. So to come in now and say, oh, she saw a red or orange car, it's just not reliable evidence. It's not reliable evidence, ladies and gentlemen, 37 years later. What else? So Angela Hicks said there was a burning car a few days after Jonelle disappeared. But she also said that car wasn't running, and she wasn't clear on that, so we replayed her interview from when she first started talking to the police about this, the Greeley police, and she was clear that that car was not running. That car was absolutely not running. So if there was, for some reason, a red or orange car around the school, around the bank on the night of Jonelle's disappearance, it was a different car because the car, whatever car was burned up, according to Angela, was not running. Okay, so it couldn't have been the same car. And look, did Mr. Pankey have, when he was running Arenado, did he have red cars on his lot? Yeah, there were red cars on the lot. We've seen the photos. People have red cars, especially when you're on a car lot. You have red cars. So yeah, there were red cars on the lot. Was some Pankey-related car involved in Jonelle Matthews' disappearance? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So because, again, Ms. Hicks said that the burnt car, the car that she saw got burned, wasn't running. Mr. Anderson said he saw a red car that he had associated, a red or brown car, I think he said, that he associated with Mr. Pankey. He didn't know when that car had come in. It had fire damage. Mr. Pankey testified regarding that car, regarding any car, I guess. He said that he had once brought a car into the Anderson's salvage yard that had been burnt in the fire at the Snyder house. And Mr. Snyder came in, and Mr. Snyder said, oh, by the way, there was a fire-damaged car in the fire when Mr. Pankey was here, running Arenado. And that fire, that car happened to be a red Toyota Celica. Surprise, surprise. So, it all matches up. There was one fire-damaged car. There was a red fire-damaged car, as Mr. Anderson said. But it was it was an inoperable car. It wasn't related to Jonelle Matthews' disappearance, and it was related to a fire at the Snyder garage in 1983 or 84. And regarding the timing of it, because I know the prosecution put on Mr. Snyder to say, oh, well, the fire happened when I was in 7th grade, which is sometime in the 70s, which, I mean, I'm sure that was Mr. Snyder's memory. I'm not suggesting otherwise, that he was anything less than completely truthful. But, I mean, if you look at their own timeline, they say October 1st of 1983 is when Mr. Pankey moved to 10th Street. And then sometime after that was when Aaron Otto was started. So, I mean, the earliest the fire could have been at the Snyder home, which they're saying Mr. Pankey was there at the time. Earliest it could have been would have been, late 83, probably 84. So again, it all matches up. The red car, it's a red herring, so to speak. A red herring meaning it's not related. Because certainly there's no red car that Mr. Pankey had any relationship to that had any involvement in Jonelle Matthews' murder. And there's just so the car evidence is unreliable, ladies and gentlemen. And finally, what about whether there's enough time to commit this crime? I think the prosecution is now all of a sudden saying, oh, well, maybe it happened, maybe the murder actually happened the next day. I mean, again, they don't really have a coherent theory here, and I guess maybe they don't have to, other than they have to show that beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Pankey committed the crimes he's charged with, which they haven't done. But what is the theory? Because they're saying, oh, Mr. Pankey made a statement that she died in the home. Okay, Mr. Pankey made that statement. I mean, we know she didn't die in the home, right? We know that. I mean, there's no blood anywhere in the home or anywhere around the home. But they're saying, oh, it must be true. Mr. Pankey said she died before she crossed 10th Street. It must be true. But then they're saying, oh, well, maybe it happened the next day. And the reason they say that is because it just, it doesn't fit together. I mean, we know the earliest possible time that Jonelle Matthews could have been abducted was sometime after 8:40 when she got off the phone with Sandy Snap. I guess they're trying to say, well, when the dog barked is when the perpetrator showed up. Maybe. But even if that's true, the perpetrator would have had to have gotten in the house, would have had to somehow get control of Jonelle Matthews, would have had to get Ms. Matthews into the car, would have had to drive Jonelle Matthews the 35 minutes to where she died, or I guess would have had to kill her on the way, and then, it's not clear, but would have certainly had to drive to the burial location and would have had to drive back. And if it was Mr. Pankey, would have had to dig a grave and would have had to have killed her at some point. And all of these things would have had to happen between, I guess, 8:42 when the dog barked and 11 o'clock when we know Mr. Pankey was at home in bed, right? Because the one thing they didn't mention is that Ms. Hicks said, oh, well, I can't say where he was that night, but I can tell you, 11 o'clock, he was in bed, okay? And I know that. There was nothing unusual about that night. He was always in bed by 11. So all these things would have had to happen. 35-minute drive out, 35-minute drive back, all these other things from 8:42 at the earliest to 11 o'clock. It just doesn't make any sense, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, they said, you don't leave your common sense at the door, and that's right, you don't leave your common sense at the door. So does that make any sense to you? And then the question is, well, I guess, now they're trying to say, did he do it the next day? I mean, I don't understand. He murdered her the next day? What? I don't know. Is she in the trunk? I mean, where is she? Or it doesn't make sense. So there wasn't enough time. There's not enough time. So again, there's just the circumstantial evidence does not add up. It does not add up in this matter, ladies and gentlemen. We'd ask you to consider that when you evaluate this case. All right. Let me talk to you about statements by Ms. Hicks. So Ms. Hicks testified in this matter. She said that she never suspected her ex-husband, Steve, of committing this homicide until 1999, 15 years later, after he came to her and said, oh, by the way, the police and the DA want information from me regarding Jonelle Matthews' murder. And that's, and Exhibit 164 talks about that. And you know, did she have a motive? Yeah, we suggest that she did. She was getting ready to divorce him. She did divorce him. This was something that she used in the divorce. She brought to her attorney's attention. She went and got documents relating to this through her allegations and gave them to her attorney. And all of a sudden, 15 years later, all of a sudden these things come back to her about what happened on that week between the 20th and the 27th of December 1984. And we suggest to you that it's not true, it's not accurate. And there was nothing unusual about that trip. So here are a few of the things that don't add up. She said that Mr. Pankey dumped the dogs, right? And that, you know, if that's true, I mean, that's awful, right? I mean, you know, well, not all of us, a lot of us are probably dog owners, and we love our dogs, and that's just a terrible thing. I mean, probably the worst thing you can do after murdering a child is, you know, murdering or being responsible for the death of a dog, all right? So, you know, that's a terrible allegation. But is it true? Is it true? No. And the reason we know that is because, well, Mr. Pankey testified that it wasn't true. But also, you know, his testimony makes more sense because he said, we got rid of the fence, and when we got rid of the fence, we got rid of the dogs, all right? Because those dogs were big dogs and they need to be behind a fence. And so there's been no evidence of when that fence was removed. We looked in the paper, we weren't able to find the thrifty nickel ad showing that he had sold that fence, but clearly the fence isn't there now. I mean, you can look at Exhibit 106 it shows the house, and there's clearly no fence there now. The fence was removed many, many years ago, and the evidence shows that the fence was removed before the dogs were removed. But once the dogs were removed, once the fence was removed, and look, it also makes sense because, you know, unfortunately, Mr. Pankey was not a great provider in those days, and in 1984, you know, Aaron Auto did okay for a little while, but it started to go downhill. We know, we know, for instance, that the record got repoed, right? I mean, they put on that evidence. The record got repossessed because he couldn't afford to pay for it. The cars got repossessed, but you know, Mr. Pankey had to sell some of the fence around his house for scrap metal to support his family. He was doing whatever he could to support his family in the summer of '84. All right, so I suggest to you the dumping the dogs allegation is not true. What about this notion that TV and radio were prohibited? I mean, Mark said it's not true, you know, and Mark, you know, so you heard from Mark, and you can choose to believe or disbelieve Mark, but he watched cartoons throughout his childhood. You remember Steve listening to Southwest Radio Church. You know, so, I mean, the whole reason that Ms. Hicks says she remembers this is because, oh, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Steve starts listening to the radio, but it's not really consistent with the other evidence. Certainly the evidence coming from Mark, who is, you know, I'm not going to say he's an unbiased witness, but he's sort of caught between his two parents, you know, in this case. But he swore to tell the truth, and that's what he did. And he says, I watched cartoons throughout my childhood. And Steve listened to the radio. We also know that there was nothing found in the yard. Ms. Hicks says that Steve went digging in the yard. as soon as they heard that, Greeley PD rushed over there, and they didn't find anything, of course. There's nothing in the yard to support that allegation. And again, the burned up car, we've already talked about, but it was not an operational car by Ms. Hicks' own testimony. And the only car that we know was brought to Anderson Salvage that had burn damage was burned by lightning, and it was a Snyder vehicle. So none of her allegations are really corroborated, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, I mean, she could be telling the truth. We suggest to you that she, Ms. Hicks does have a motive. She did have a motive back then in 1999 because she was trying to get a one-up on the divorce. She has a motive. She has a general motive because, Steve was just kind of a jerk to her throughout their marriage. And she has another specific motive, which is that she was really mad, and she told you she was really mad when she heard Steve say that he had talked to her dad on the 27th of December, 1984. And Steve told you, again, that wasn't true. But she was really mad about it, really mad. And she hasn't talked to him since. She has not talked to him since. And she cooperated completely with these guys. I mean, completely. I mean, not only did she give them the information that they wanted, she's emailing them, she's texting them, she's calling them. I mean, she wants this prosecution, ladies and gentlemen. So now the one thing that Ms. Hicks did say that is, I suppose, arguably supports the prosecution's allegations in this case, is that Steve did say something to her about being aware of the raking in the snow, okay? And the quote from Ms. Hicks is, it doesn't say anything about footprints, by the way, it just says snow was raked. But apparently, and she wrote that in 99, so apparently in 99, Steve said he had knowledge that the snow was raked, all right? Mr. Pankey's told you that he got that from Officer Lockwood. We believe that testimony is credible. But in addition, this by then this information about the snow being raked was in the public domain. You heard from Sharon Stala, a woman who she actually worked in Kersey at Mr. Matthews Middle School, where he was principal, and she knew about it. She knew that the snow was raked. So by that point, it was in the public domain. So there's nothing really all that unusual about it. So again, do Ms. Hicks's statements add up? Do they incriminate Mr. Pankey? I mean, if you believe everything she says, you could come to that conclusion, but I suggest to you that her testimony, she does have a motive to see her ex-husband convicted in this matter, and a lot of her statements aren't corroborated, and to the extent that they are corroborated, they're innocent explanations. They're innocent explanations for Mr. Pankey's conduct. All right. So let's talk about Steve Pankey as a person for a minute, all right? So what do we know about Mr. Pankey? And you've learned a lot about Mr. Pankey over the course of this month. He's a true crime junkie. He says that. He's a self-professed true crime junkie. It's consistent with, all this past conduct. He loves the show Unsolved Mysteries. He loves these podcasts, these criminal podcasts. This Killer Vibes show. He loves, he was enthralled with Oklahoma City. No, he was enthralled with David Koresh, I should say, with the matter in Idaho, Randy Weaver. He likes that stuff. Different people have different interests. Mr. Pankey likes that stuff. And frankly, he does also have an interest in the Matthews case. He does. And why is that? Well, I mean, we know that Russ Ross was the last person to drop her off, before she died. And we know Mr. Pankey doesn't particularly like Mr. Ross, so, he took a particular interest in the case because of that, certainly. But he's been interested in the case. He's expressed an interest in the case. He's been open about that. And he doesn't deny that today. But having an interest in the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews is not the same as being involved in the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. And I suggest to you there really is no evidence of the latter. And then after he became a suspect, after Detective Cash and Detective Prill, well, after the body was found and after Detectives Cash and Prill came to his house, strike that. Detective Cash called him in April of 2019. That's the first call. And Detective Cash, at that point, I mean, he tells Mr. Pankey that he's just a witness, but, Detective Cash is interested at that point. Mr. Pankey's worried at that point. And again, he's a person who is, paranoid, and he believes in conspiracies, and he has self-esteem issues and all those things we talked about earlier. And so, they called his brother. Detective Cash called his brother first, and Mr. Pankey, he's worried at that point, and so he is ramping up his interest. Like, am I going to be, are they going to consider me a suspect now? So yeah, after that, he does start making more searches related to the Jonelle Matthews case, and certainly after the body's found, even more searches. After the search warrant that's in July of 19. After the search warrant is executed in August of 19, more searches. I mean, yeah, he's worried. Mr. Pankey, I think anybody would be worried, frankly. And then Mr. Pankey, who's a, paranoid conspiracy theorist with self-esteem issues, he's really worried. So, yeah, his searches do ramp up. Again, does that mean he's involved? No. All right, what else? Mr. Pankey does have a mental illness. We know that about Mr. Pankey. Now, Dr. Chamberlain testified. Dr. Chamberlain diagnosed him with Asperger's. Mr. Pankey said other people, there have been previous diagnoses of him to that effect. I'll be honest. Mr. Rourke did a pretty good job of cross-examining Dr. Chamberlain. Dr. Chamberlain, didn't hold up great under cross-examination. There were names that were transposed and mistakes in his report. Sure, okay, that's true. We're not gonna tell you anything different, all right? But be that as it may, Dr. Chamberlain he's the only licensed psychologist who testified in this case, and he said Mr. Pankey has Asperger's. If you don't very clear that Mr. Pankey has a mental illness of some kind. He disagrees with it, right? You heard him say he doesn't think he does, and he doesn't think he does. But everyone else does. Detective Cash does. Detective Cash, in a moment of candor, in this case, told Angela Hicks, oh, I think he's mentally ill. He's always inserting himself into all these cases. Detective Cash said that. But look, you see all these crazy things that he writes. Who? Well, I guess as a lawyer, it's clear. But I think even those of us who aren't trained lawyers would know that to write in a collection case or a misdemeanor case in another state about an investigation of a murder in Colorado and to somehow try to gain leverage from that, it just makes no sense. It's just nutty. It's nutty. And he didn't get any leverage out of it. What was the end game there? It's just, they're trying to say he's a master manipulator and he's so smart. It served no purpose. It was just strange. All right? And so, again, the way he's acted, the things he's written, all those things, as well as the medical diagnosis, and the investigating detective's own analysis can all lead you to believe that Mr. Pankey has a mental illness. I guess that's your decision, whether you believe that or not, but we believe the evidence is pretty strong that he did and does. What else do we know? That he's exaggerated his involvement in other cases. We know, because we heard from Janice Story, who flew out here from Idaho, we know that he told her that he was involved in the cult murder of Mary Pierce, which wasn't true. And we know, because we also heard from Russ Michael, who also flew out here from Idaho, that although Mr. Pankey says that the Blaine County Sheriff was planting evidence at the murder scene of Sarah Johnson's parents, we know that's not true. In Mr. Pankey's mind, it probably is true. I mean, Mr. Pankey did work for Mr. Michael, but it's not true. He inserted himself into that case, again, because of his self-esteem issues and all the other things going on with him. You know, he's a busybody, he gets himself in the middle of these things, and just as he got himself involved in this Jonelle Matthews investigation, he also got himself involved in the Sarah Johnson investigation, and he also admitted to a murder he didn't commit of Mary Pierce. All right? All right, so what else do I want to tell you about Steve? You know, I don't like to say it about my own client, but Steve Pankey's kind of a jerk. He is kind of a jerk. And we talked about this during voir dire, and I talked about it in opening. But it's a fact. It's a fact, and we can't hide from it. We can't hide from it, all right? And, you know, again, I don't like to say bad things about my client, but I think it's important for the big picture here for you to know all these things, because, you know, a jerk is not the same as a murderer. But he is a jerk. You know, he told his wife, his then wife, that having romantic relations with her was an act of mercy. Who does that? I mean, nobody who's happily married, certainly. Who does that? All right? There's testimony that he wanted to press charges against a woman who was pregnant because she pushed a camera out of her face. Again, who does that? There was evidence that he called a parishioner at the Sunnyview Church and said, you couldn't keep your wife, you know, a parishioner who was getting divorced, Harold Reif, and said you couldn't keep your wife. I mean, just not nice, not nice. And finally, there was evidence that he did, in fact, withhold pain-reducing treatment for a police officer who had injured his leg. All those things are awful. They're just awful. I mean, he's a jerk. I'm sorry, but he is a jerk. But is he a murderer? No. You know, jerk, guilty as charged. Murderer, not guilty. And again, in addition to Steve acting like a jerk, we have to acknowledge, and we do acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, that the Matthews family, they're good people, all right? They are good, solid, salt-of-the-earth people, okay? We admit that. We admit that, ladies and gentlemen. The death of their 12-year-old daughter was an absolute abysmal tragedy. And what they've had to endure since then, no other human being should have to endure. But they've done it with grace and humility. And, you know, you heard, getting back to this situation with Mr. Reif, I mean, it was a contrast that, I don't know if you noticed it, but I did, that Harold Reif said Mr. Pankey called him and said, you couldn't keep your ex-wife. And he said that he went to the Matthews home, and the Matthews were consoling him because he was so distraught about losing his wife. I mean, that's what good people do. That's what good people do, ladies and gentlemen. And, you know, and we also don't shy away from that, all right? Matthews are good people. They deserve closure in this matter. I think a bunch of you said that during voir dire, and nobody really disagreed with that. But I think we also all agreed during voir dire that the Matthewses should not have closure at the expense of an innocent man. I think we all agreed on that, and I think we all still agree with that, right? So you cannot have closure at the expense of an innocent man. And the court has told you in the instructions, and I don't think the Matthews would disagree, that if you have a reasonable doubt as to Mr. Pankey's guilt, you should acquit Mr. Pankey, notwithstanding the fact that they're really good people who have been through a horrible tragedy, and Mr. Pankey's kind of a jerk. All right? All right, I want to talk to you for just a minute about some of the things the prosecution said in the initial closing. And by the way, they get to go first and last, so they're going to come up again, and I won't have a chance to rebut it, but you know the evidence, ladies and gentlemen. I asked you just consider the evidence and be aware of the potential contradiction of whatever they say in their last speech. All right? But as far as what was said in the initial closing, I just want to address some of those statements. So they said, well, Mr. Pankey made a statement about Ms. Matthews being dead before she crossed 10th Street. As far as the route goes, how do you get to Kersey? That's I guess something you can determine what route you would take. Who knows? But 10th Street obviously is the biggest street here in Greeley, always has been. And so to the extent that there's any reference to 10th Street by Mr. Pankey, I suggest to you it really doesn't have any bearing on his guilt or innocence in this matter, especially when you also consider his statement to Detective Statler in January of 1985, where Mr. Pankey supposedly said that she was dead before she left the house. I mean, because that contradicts, that contradicts the evidence, certainly. There's no evidence of that. And Captain Statler said, yeah, if there had been any blood, anything red, anything that even looked like blood, we would have collected it and we would have preserved it. And there wasn't. So clearly she wasn't dead before she left the house. I mean, that just wasn't true. So Mr. Pankey's spouting off and saying strange things. And again, we're asking you to, at least through the deliberations, we're asking you to get inside his head here a little bit. I mean, I know that's not necessarily a comfortable place to be, but if you get inside his head, he says strange things. He does strange things. Does that mean he's a murderer? No, it does not. But in a lot of things he's true. She wasn't killed in the house. We know that. They can, as far as this quilt business goes, I mean, yeah, Mr. Pankey made a statement, I guess, about a quilt, that a quilt had been removed. They're now trying to say, oh, well, there was a quilt in the bedroom that was normally downstairs. Who knows when that quilt went up there? I mean, we know Jonelle was downstairs. She took off her pantyhose and her shoes. She went back upstairs. She got slippers. She was up and down. Who knows when that quilt was moved? But it certainly wasn't removed from the house. So to the extent that Mr. Pankey made a statement, oh, I know there was a quilt removed from the house, there wasn't a quilt removed from the house, and they can't bootstrap the fact that a quilt normally in the basement was up in the bedroom to being a quilt that was removed from the house. So again, none of the statements Mr. Pankey has made are really consistent with the evidence. All right. Mr. Miller also said, well, he used Jonelle Matthews' murder to manipulate the system, and he's talking about the Idaho court system. I mean, really? I mean, if that's how you manipulate the system, I think Mr. Pankey needs to go to law school, because it had no bearing on any of those cases, and really didn't do him any favors at all, and just all it did was, pique the interest of the Greeley DA, of the Greeley Police Department and the Weld County DA's office. they say, oh, Mr. Pankey knew that in early 1985, he knew that she was dead because he said in church, he said that the pastor was preaching falsely about her being found alive. I don't know. I mean, Mr. Matthews even said, after a few months, he was certainly concerned Jonelle was dead. I think anytime you have a 12-year-old girl missing for a substantial period of time with no resources, no monetary resources, no family resources out on the street, I mean, the presumption's going to be that person's dead. I mean, I think everybody kind of knew it in the back of their head. So to say, oh, Mr. Pankey, knew she was dead. I mean, come on, that wasn't a big leap. And they also said, oh, Mr. Pankey owned red cars. Yeah, Mr. Pankey owned red cars in his lot. He also owned white cars and brown cars and black cars, and so what? We've already gone over the car thing, and it just doesn't add up. All right, so let me talk to you then for a few minutes now. Before I conclude, I do want to talk to you about who we maintain committed this crime, and you know what our allegation is, and the defense maintains that the most likely suspect in this matter was Norris Drake. All right, so let me talk about that for a minute. So first of all, Mr. Miller referenced the statement by Francis Drake, and it was read into the record because it was in Detective Olson's report that he sent out he sent the case out for review. But the initial report taken by Officer Howell on morning of the 21st states as follows. Francis Drake, 321 43rd Avenue Court, phone 352-0690. She advised she arrived home on 12/20/84 at 3:30 to 4 p.m. I'm sorry, 3:30 to 3:40 p.m. that she neither saw nor heard anyone unusual. She advised her boy, Norris Drake, was at her residence on the evening of 12/20/84, and he left around 9:30 p.m. Francis said that Norris sat in his vehicle for a while before leaving, as if he may have been watching something. Francis says she was trying to call Norris to ask if he saw anything, and she would contact GPD if so. So she didn't say that she actually saw him left. She said he was sitting in his vehicle before leaving. She said he left around 9:30. She said he was looking and he saw something, looking out toward the street as if he saw something, and maybe he did see something. Maybe he did see that there was that the garage door was open at the Matthews home, and there was a young girl walking within the home, and it appeared that no one else was there. Maybe that's what he saw, ladies and gentlemen. I think the evidence would support that. And what else? So what's the other evidence against Norris Drake? We know that he had an interest in young girls, young post-pubescent girls, per Andrea Yost, his ex-girlfriend. We know that his father had recently died. We know that he had a drug and alcohol problem. Peggy Drake testified to that. We know that he was at his mother's house that night. We know that he left sometime after 9 p.m. That's when the Cosby Show ended. And, I know that Peggy Drake is now trying to say, oh, I remember 37 years ago, and well, I wanted Norris to leave, but he wouldn't leave, and I told him he had to leave, but she never said anything like that. In 1989, she was interviewed, and look, I understand her desire to protect her brother, and we get that, but I mean, that didn't really happen. We know he left sometime after 9. We know that and you have the tape-in evidence, the video, and you can listen to, of Norris Drake. But we know that he noticed that Jonelle had been maturing. All right. If you look at Exhibit 60, the map of the street, you'll see that he could have gotten from the driveway to the Matthews home without leaving any of those weird footprints in the snow. In contrast with Steve Pankey, we don't have his shoe size, by the way, but I'm guessing it's probably 8.5 to 9, let's say. We know, now with regard to Jason C., the next door neighbor, Jason C., he says he heard his dog barking at 8:42. And their position is, oh, well, that had to have been the perpetrator. Well, I don't know. I mean, we also know that that they found cigarettes in Jonelle's room. You know, had Jonelle gone out smoking, had a cigarette well before her parents got home? We don't know. It could have been Jonelle. But as far as Jason C. is concerned, I mean, let's follow that up. If Jason's, we also know about Jason C., the next door neighbor, who he was 16 at that time in 1984. Now he's a grown man. He had told Captain Statler just a few days later. He said, "Oh, by the way, when Jonelle thought there was a burglar in the house one time, she came over to my house and I sort of kept her company until her parents got home, because she was scared." So she knew, ladies and gentlemen, she knew that Jason C. was available, that he was willing to protect her, and that he could have protected her. And yet, when she walked out of that house, and I assume she walked out because, again, there's no evidence she was murdered in the home. So when she walked out of that house, she did not yell or scream or do anything to get Jason C.'s attention, as far as we know. And again, this was a young, feisty girl who knew how to assert herself. She didn't do any of those things. And we suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, so getting back to Norris Drake, if Norris Drake comes over there, he goes, "Oh, you know, my mom was across the street, you know, and you know, she's lived in the neighborhood a long time. It's Frances Drake, and Peggy Drake's my sister, and, you know, blah, blah, blah." And he starts talking to her. Again, there's no reason, we don't know exactly what happened, and I'm not going to speculate the way they have. But suffice it to say that if he'd gone over there, he would have definitely been able to talk to Jonelle in a way that Steve Pankey, who was not there, but Steve Pankey would not have been able to talk to her because Steve Pankey had no basis for talking to her. Norris Drake did. So, again, the fact that there was no scream, nobody saw anything, you know, nobody saw an unusual car. So getting back to that car issue for just a moment, I'm sorry, I'm almost done, I know, we're not my welcome here. But getting back to this car issue for a minute, you know, Norris Drake's car was already there, and it was in the driveway, initially anyway. It was in the driveway, and nobody would have thought anything unusual about that. So if that police officer who was checking on the girl who lived on 43rd Court, if he had looked down the street, he would have just seen the Norris Drake's, actually his friend's truck in the driveway, he wouldn't have thought anything of it. But if there had been an unusual car of some kind in front of the house, in front of the Matthews house, someone would have noticed that. So again, the evidence is more consistent with it being somebody who knew her, someone in Norris Drake's position who sort of belonged in the neighborhood, and it all fits together in that regard. We also know, ladies and gentlemen, that Norris Drake did not get home until between 2 and 4 the next morning. Connie Davier told you that. That's very suspicious. I guess their position now would be, oh, he's an alcoholic, he was probably out drinking. Well, maybe he was out drinking, maybe he was out burying a body, maybe he was out burying a body and then drinking. We don't know. But suffice it to say, him being home between 2 and 4 in the morning on the 21st is way more consistent with him having committed this crime than Steve Pankey being home by 11. We also know from Connie Davier that first thing in the morning, this is sort of glossed over, but I'd really ask you to think about this, ladies and gentlemen. Norris Drake went in the house, woke up Connie Davier, went down to the basement. There was no phone down there, she said. Okay. He came up the next morning and immediately starts talking about the abduction of Jonelle Matthews. We know from Peggy Drake that he never came back to the house that night. He never came back. And yet the next morning, before he's had a chance to talk to anybody on the phone or see any of the investigation being conducted, at the Matthews home. Before any of this stuff happens, he's out there talking to Connie Davier about Jonelle Matthews' disappearance. And we know that he knew about the raked footprints, okay? So, I mean, that's their biggest talking point, and we know that Norris Drake knew about it too. I think they're trying to say, oh, well, Detective Olson planted that idea in his head. I mean, come on, Detective Olson, he worked for Mike Rourke, I mean, for many years. And, they liked his work so much that they hired him at the DA's office. And all the police officers said, yeah, we did do follow-up reports on this, and we don't know where they are. Things were lost. I mean, before they realized this was a big deal, I think Detective Prill, I believe, was the one saying, yeah, there's just so much stuff here, and stuff got misplaced, and we switched computer systems, and yeah, there's probably not everything is here. But now they're trying to say, oh, Detective Olson didn't know what he was doing. But yeah, Detective Olson did know what he was doing. And Detective Olson interviewed Norris Drake, and Norris Drake said, and I encourage you to listen to the videotape, which is in evidence. Norris Drake said, yeah, I knew about the rake footprints. They used his own garden rake. They used his own garden rake. So he knew a lot about that, and no one else did. No one else did. He said, I think on the tape, that he heard it from his mom, but there's really no evidence of that. And the evidence that they presented is that that this information about the rake was not publicized to people in the neighborhood. So I suggest to you that he told his mom, he would have told his mom, not the other way around. And the reason is because he's the likely suspect to have committed this crime. All right, I guess just, a couple things I just want to bring to your attention. When you go back in the jury room, in addition to this tape of Norris Drake, there's Exhibit F, which is Steve Pankey's campaign flyer for sheriff, antidote for bozo sheriff investigations. And then there's also this cover letter that he sent, it's Exhibit C. He sent it to the Idaho Judicial Council, and it says, in 2000, it says a lot of things, but I want to point out that it says, in 2003, I was an Idaho licensed mortician apprentice working for Blaine County Coroner, Wood River Chapel. In that capacity, I was on location at the murders of Alan and Diane Johnson in Bellevue, Idaho. I heard Blaine County Sheriff Walt Femling say, quote, he was going to move evidence to make a case, unquote, against Sarah Johnson. I was also witness to evidence compromising at the Johnson murder location / home. Mr. Pankey, I think, probably does believe this is what happened, but this did not happen. Again, he's paranoid. He's a conspiracy theorist. He's got self-esteem issues. He gets himself in the middle of investigations. He asserts himself. Detective Cash knew that. Detective Cash told Angela Hicks that. And that's the truth. He asserted himself also into the Jonelle Matthews investigation when he didn't have any involvement in her disappearance. Ladies and gentlemen, the death of Jonelle Matthews was a terrible tragedy. A 12-year-old girl dying in that manner is just an unfathomable horror. Hearts go out to the Matthews family. And all of us, including Mr. Pankey, are very sorry. We can't tell you beyond a reasonable doubt that Norris Drake killed Jonelle Matthews. It's not our burden to prove that, and we can't say we have proven it beyond a reasonable doubt. But what we can say is that he's a much more likely suspect in this matter than Steve Pankey is. What we can also tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the case against Steve Pankey screams reasonable doubt. It screams reasonable doubt. And what we can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that it would be a travesty to convict Steve Pankey on the basis of the evidence that's been presented in this case. And we ask you to find Steve Pankey not guilty of all charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fjorst. Mr. Rourke.
Good morning. I agree with Mr. Verhorst in one respect. If you think he got on the stand for 2 days and lied to you, he's absolutely guilty of killing Jonelle Matthews. Now, I want to be very clear about something, though, as I preface the remainder of my remarks in this argument. The burden of proof to prove that the defendant committed these crimes rests right here at my table. They have zero burden. They don't have to do a thing. Mr. Verhorst could have sat in his chair like a lump for the entirety of this trial, and the burden of proof rests with us. That's the way it's supposed to be. But when they do present evidence, it's your obligation to evaluate it, view it, and consider it like every other piece of evidence. What you have seen during the course of this trial is an amazing evolution of a defense. What do I mean by that? There have been a lot of phases to what has happened from this table. From pastoral privilege, to Harold Hicks had a body to bury, to Harold Hicks had a body to bury because a cop asked for help and it would look bad for Steve, to Norris Drake did it. Well, Peggy Drake and the TV guide kind of put that argument to bed. To the defendant has Asperger's syndrome, which doesn't exist, by the way, in any significant peer-reviewed literature anymore. It's autism spectrum disorder. But that argument kind of went away too, didn't it? Because we got treated to T. Carey Chamberlain. And the evaluation or the diagnosis of some other person whose test scores were not his. The defendant told you he didn't have a mental illness, doesn't have a mental illness, but you know who else did? Through Dr. Chamberlain? Dr. Schneider. Gave him the PAI, Personality Assessment Inventory. Nothing diagnosable. To then the defendant getting on the stand and telling you that he made it all up. What a remarkable statement. That for 37 years, ladies and gentlemen, I have made this up. I have made it up at every turn for leverage, but I have made it up. Let's take a moment and evaluate the credibility of the defendant as he testified. What was actually happening when he testified? Because this was amazing. He got on the stand and he told you the story of this LA County Sheriff's deputy that Mr. Miller alluded to. He tells you about all these different things that he has made up, but then he also says something remarkable. He said on the way up, before he testified, he was thinking to himself, maybe I shouldn't testify because I would just be telling more lies. His words, not mine. And then he told us several times, on direct once and on cross-examination the other time, that during his preparation for testimony, he would offer an answer, and please excuse my language, but he was told, that answer's bullshit, no one will believe you. What is happening? The truth doesn't change. Because then when he would give a good answer, he got praised for it.
Objection,
truth-
Your Honor, that's inhibiting the attorney-client privilege.
Overruled.
The truth doesn't change, but it does for him. And he told you that. Don't say that. No one will believe you. In order for you to believe what came from this witness stand, out of his mouth, you have to believe this. Not only is he, for some inexplicable reason, fixated on Jonelle Matthews, and he made all of this up, but there is a grand conspiracy to convict him. There is a grand conspiracy by Mark Lockwood, Cam Daggett, Angela Hicks, who is a woman scorn according to the defendant, Vanessa Sokolinsky, Mike Prill, Robert Cash, Jack Stotler, Don Lyon, Darren Ford, Lee Edgerton, John Gates, Mark Jones, Kenny Anderson, John Dobner, Rochelle Baxley, Russell Baxley, Peggy Drake, Rob Miller, Lacey Wells, and Michael Rourke. And why do I say that? Is it merely a coincidence that the case that he fixates on is also the case that Angela Hicks has all of this information about? That Mark Lockwood has talked to in a hospital setting and said, you should go give that family closure. Same case that the defendant made all this up about. The same case that Vanessa talks about him having a red car. The same case in which Detective Prill goes to the Twin Falls, Idaho and spits on him. Come on. Ladies and gentlemen, he's either the most unlucky individual on the planet because that conspiracy exists to convict him in a case that he fixates on, or he's guilty. It's as simple as that. Because the evidence that you have heard in this case really boils down to one thing. Did he do it? There's no argument from anybody about the fact that Jonelle Matthews was the victim of a murder of the first degree after deliberation. There's no argument from anybody that she is the victim of a felony murder in the first degree, and that she is the victim of a second-degree kidnapping. All of that is beyond dispute. The only dispute is the elements you have before you when it talks about that the defendant, identity. And oh, by the way, all the searching that he did on this case that he was fixated on, above all others, was deleted. Why? Why was only that deleted? Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of searches for Jonelle Matthews deleted. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see on full display what a guilty mind looks like, focus on 5 dates and the conduct of the defendant surrounding those 5 dates to answer the question beyond a reasonable doubt that he is the defendant, or excuse me, he is the individual who killed Jonelle Matthews. December 22nd, 1984, unannounced, early in the morning, leaving to go to California to get out of Dodge, unannounced, unpacked, to get out of town. December 26th, Mr. Miller mentioned it earlier, 1984, the maniacal searching of the radio and the newspaper to see what information law enforcement has. Angela Hicks reading the articles that she talked about not once, not twice, 3 times each. You have in Exhibit 209 the articles that had been published during that time frame that they were in California. Watch what he does in Exhibit 209 in April of 2019 after Detective Cash calls him, and the incredible increase in searching that occurs immediately after that phone call. Pay very close attention, as Mr. Miller indicated earlier, to the defendant's conduct on his devices after July 23rd of 2019. He didn't go to sleep for an entire night searching to find out what the police knew about Jonelle Matthews. Pay very close attention to what he did on his devices after they knocked on his front door August 15th of 2019. If you have any question about whether or not the defendant was credible when he testified, listen to Exhibit 123A that was introduced yesterday. And stop the recording when you get to the part where Mike Prill spit on him. If you have any doubts about whether the defendant was credible on the stand, pay very close attention to when he searched for the terms INFJ and Asperger's. And when you find that it was in August of 2019, remember the answer that he gave me as to why he searched for that. Because he saw it mentioned in the comments to the Unfound podcast. But the Unfound podcast didn't air for 2 more months. Hadn't even been recorded yet. If you believe that he told you something other than the truth beyond a reasonable doubt, then you have the right to find him guilty. His words. And I agree. Why, within just a few days of being arrested in Idaho for the murder of Jonelle Matthews, does he get on the phone with his sister and start talking about guns using code words? And ask yourself, where are the other ones? Because they only talked about 10. But there were 13 in that house. Ask yourself why the guns are being secreted out of a home by his sister to his attorney in Idaho, with her keeping one. One stays with her the entire time. Ladies and gentlemen, the defense has argued from day one that there's no motive in this case. And we talked about the fact that we don't have to prove a motive. But you know what? When there is one, and we can prove it, it sure helps answer the question about whether or not the defendant is guilty. Let me share with you a story. A story which unfortunately we all had to sit here, we all had to hear, but it's very telling. It's the story of a sheriff's deputy in Los Angeles County, California, who was tortured. Never said before until he got on that stand. It's not in any of his writings. It's not in any of his searches. He told us about that for the first time on the stand, and you know what? He told you his motive in this case. Because what he told you is he was so filled with hatred for what white police officers did during the Watts riots that when in the course of his responsibilities and duties as an ambulance technician employee, he encountered a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy with a broken leg, shattered leg, who's begging for help, begging for an air cast, begging for any assistance whatsoever. He did nothing. He watched. He listened to the screams. He listened to the begging. He allowed another human being torture and misery to get back at a completely unrelated group of people. And then he told you of the hatred that he had for Russ Ross, for the Greeley Police Department, and for the Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene. It doesn't matter if he knew who Jonelle Matthews was. Jonelle Matthews is that sheriff's deputy that he used as a pawn to get back at those that he hated the most. Hatred was his word, ladies and gentlemen, not mine. That is his motive in this case, and he told you all about it from that stand right there. Exhibit 1, please. The very thought that a young woman, not yet a teenager, on the eve of Christmas, which she looked forward to so much, could not only be murdered, but unceremoniously cast out, her body thrown away, buried in an unmarked grave, is repugnant. It is the ultimate sign of disrespect. But really what it says is, not only will I take your life, but I will ensure that your family never rests, your church never rests, the police department investigating this will never rest, you will never rest. The fact that such an atrocious act could take place and be so well concealed, ladies and gentlemen, must not equal an acquittal. Because as one legal scholar once wrote, secreting a crime, even for a very long period of time, is one form of success for which society has no reward. The search, ladies and gentlemen, for justice for Jonelle Matthews ends today. The evidence in this case has proven beyond a reasonable doubt, a doubt based upon reason and common sense, that Jonelle Matthews was kidnapped, Jonelle Matthews was murdered, and the master manipulator did it. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Rourke. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll turn to instruction number 20. The bailiff will now escort you to the jury room. Upon reaching the jury room, you are to select one of your members to be the foreperson of the jury. Your foreperson will preside over your deliberations and shall sign whatever verdict you reach. The verdict reached must represent the considered judgment of each juror. In order to return a verdict, it is necessary that each juror agree to it. Your verdict in any count must be unanimous. The verdict forms and these instructions shall remain in the possession of your foreperson until such time as they are called for by the judge in open court. Upon reaching the verdict, you will inform the bailiff of this court, who in turn will notify the court, and you will remain in your jury room until called into the courtroom by the judge. You will be provided 3 verdict forms. When you have unanimously agreed upon a verdict, you will make the selection which reflects your verdict, and the foreperson will sign it as the court has stated. The unsigned verdict selection shall be returned with no markings on it. You are further instructed that no inferences are to be drawn from the order in which the verdict choices appear on the verdict forms. The verdict forms you will receive read as follows. Jury verdict count 1, same caption I referenced earlier. Murder in the first degree after deliberation. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey guilty of murder in the first degree after deliberation. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey not guilty of murder in the first degree after deliberation. Note, please sign 1. Jury verdict count 2, murder in the first degree, felony murder. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey guilty of murder in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey not guilty of murder in the first degree felony murder. Please sign 1. Jury verdict count 3, second degree kidnapping. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey guilty of second degree kidnapping. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey not guilty of second degree kidnapping. Note, please sign 1. Jury verdict count 4, false reporting to the authorities. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey guilty of false reporting to authorities. We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Dana Pankey not guilty of false reporting to the authorities. Note, please sign 1. Now, ladies and gentlemen, now time for the court to advise the jury panel who the alternate jurors are. I want to remind you that the alternate jurors are selected by rule, and there's no reflection on the individual to be an appropriate juror. We have 3 alternate jurors in this case, and those are jurors 4, 5, and 6. Therefore, you are now excused from jury deliberations. However, you are not discharged from your juror service. If during jury deliberation, the need arises for you to fill in for one of your fellow jurors, you will be asked to join deliberations. Therefore, it's critical that you not discuss the testimony, do any research on the case, or otherwise violate any of the prior orders the court has advised you of with respect to your role as a juror. I'd ask that you leave your contact information with the judicial assistants and bailiffs and be available to appear promptly before the court if required. If your service as a juror is needed, the bailiff will contact you. If a verdict is reached without the need for your service, you'll be discharged of your juror duties. We always offer the opportunity for alternates to come back for the reading of any verdicts if you wish. And then after the conclusion, if any verdict is reached, I will then have the opportunity to speak to all the jurors, including yourselves, if you desire. So in a moment, when I excuse the other jurors, I'll have you just stay to the side. The bailiffs will get your belongings from the jury room, collect your information, and then give you some additional documentation from the court. So with that, if I could have, and let me just advise the jurors that you may not have contact with persons outside of the jury deliberation room while deliberating, with the exception of notifying the bailiff that you have a question, a verdict, or that you wish to take a break. You are to engage in